Do you find yourself searching, yearning for more, but you don't know what that more is? I'm Catherine Duncan, near-death survivor, mystic, and intuitive. Welcome to Everyday Awakening. On this podcast, I explore what it means to be alive. I help you awaken into your soul and live fully now. Through inspiring conversations, we'll dive into mindfulness, spirituality, and the transformative power of presence and living aligned with this universal energy. Together, we'll examine life's biggest questions, and I'll share practical wisdom to help you open your heart and awaken to the preciousness of being alive. Delighted to be speaking today with my guest, Ben Rein. Ben Rein is an award-winning neuroscientist, adjunct lecturer at Stanford University, clinical assistant professor at SUNNEY Buffalo, and chief science officer of the Mind Science Foundation. Ben has published over 20 peer-reviewed papers studying the neuroscience of social behavior and is the author of Why Brains Need Friends, the Neuroscience of Social Connection. In addition, Ben educates an audience of more than 1 million social media followers and has been featured on outlets including Entertainment Tonight, Good Morning America. He's received awards for his research and science communication efforts from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Thank you so much for having me. Very pleased to be here.
Great to meet you.
Yeah, you too.
So I want to start with, I love your short clips on scientific facts and research that you have out on Instagram, social media. I love how you explain it in everyday language where every one of us can digest it, and you debunk some of the false claims.
Yeah, which is a never-ending business. There's always material to debunk, unfortunately.
So tell me, do you enjoy social media? Because a lot of people are like, yikes, wow, having to be on social media. I'm curious if you enjoy it. And how do these ideas come to you? Because you do a great quick snippet on so many factual pieces that help us understand a lot of different facts about science in our daily life.
Yeah, I love it. I really do love it. And it's funny because the way I got involved with social media to begin with was a total accident. I posted a video on TikTok that was actually meant for my friends and family, and it went viral. I was chosen by the algorithm, and I was like, oh gosh, this is a real hazard here. Like, I don't want to be the TikTok scientist guy. And then I saw the reaction from the public, and I was like, this is so needed. I really never would have thought about this as a traditional academic. I was in my PhD at the time. Never would have thought this was important or useful or that anybody wanted this. And I just fell in love with being the sort of vessel that takes information from the dark halls of academic science and brings it into the light and does so in a way that's clear and accessible. So I very much enjoy it. Of course, there are parts of it that I don't enjoy. There are people who don't like science on the internet, and you get that, but it's just comes with the territory. But as far as coming up with my topics, it's something that I've developed over the years where I remember at first, probably like 4 months into starting, I hit a point where I had made probably 20 videos. And I said to my wife, I said, I'm done. There's nothing left to say. I've covered absolutely everything. There can't be anything more. And then luckily I rounded that corner, and it turns out that, there's so much interesting science out there. And the sort of skill that I've developed over the years is not only recognizing something as, oh, that's cool, that'll make a good video, but also just naturally finding that framing for just about anything in the realm of neuroscience. I come across a paper and I'm just reading a, sorry to say, but boring scientific article. And I come across one piece of information, one experiment that they did, something in the introduction or whatever it is. And I'm like, oh, that is so cool. And usually what it really comes down to is those moments for me that are transformative and educational. Those are the moments that I want to share with the viewer. And so it's natural to discover those. And I'm just a teacher by nature. I want to share those things as often as I can. So I really enjoy it.
It sounds like you focus on what's transformative, what's inspiring for you.
Yeah. And I like to think that maybe I'm a good sample or representative sample of what people find interesting. I like to think a normal person. I live a fairly active life, and I like to think that I represent not only the scientist's mind, but the every person's mind. And so,
Mhm.
yeah.
I think what's inspiring is such a great guide. I just want to point out one of your TikToks. I think you even wrote a paper about it, and I appreciate on your, I believe it's your website, you note your research, and then you have a TikTok link to it. So it really dumbs it down in like 30 seconds. Here's a snippet, but the one about owners and dogs and how both release oxytocin when you're looking at each other. I'm a huge dog lover. We have a couple dogs, and I thought, oh, that's exactly a sensation I've had about my relationship with my dogs.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a whole chapter in my forthcoming book about that, about dog relationships and how I mean it's actually incredible. The evidence suggests, and the way that I look at it is that dogs have basically hijacked the systems that we use for bonding with our newborns and made us love them the way we love our newborns. I can say I actually don't have any kids, so I can't compare it, but I love my dog, and I've always loved my dog so much. And it's incredible because what you're describing is that, there's a study where human caregivers looked at their dogs, and both sides of that party, or both parties of that, showed a rise in oxytocin levels. And there's other things that dogs do too, where when dogs express oxytocin, it's thought their eyes start to water, which makes them cuter, and so humans fall in love with them even further. So they're like kind of hijacking our brains to make us love them. They also, another thing that's amazing is they have, you've seen puppy eyes, right, where they open
Yeah,
their
yeah.
eyes in a unique way. So
Mhm.
wolves cannot do puppy eyes because there's actually a specific muscle in the eye that dogs have evolved, presumably because it makes them cuter to humans. And there's actually real life studies showing that dogs who do puppy eyes more are more likely to be adopted from shelters. They spend less time in shelters, which is a real life validation of the evolutionary reason why they got this new muscle, because it literally makes humans take them home and feed them soft food and give them a warm place to sleep. Like, that is the ultimate evolutionary benefit for a dog. So yeah, it's human dog relationships are just amazing, and I'm lucky I get to experience one every day.
That is just fascinating. And I'll just say I have two kids and we have two dogs and love all of them. But boy, dogs, their sense of complete unconditional love and
Mm,
presence,
yep,
they're such teachers. It's mind blowing. I mean, my dogs have cracked my heart open on a whole nother level. It's magical.
it really is. Yeah,
Mhm. So let's dive into your new book. Congratulations.
thank you,
So
thank you.
exciting. I want to ask you why is connection so vital for health and longevity? I mean, right now we know we're from the Surgeon General, we're in a loneliness epidemic. One out of two people are lonely. One of the biggest antidotes is connection for our well-being. But I'd love to hear from you what you have to say about, yeah, connection and longevity.
Yeah, so I think we're starting as a society to really appreciate what you just said, that we're in an isolate or a loneliness epidemic, and people aren't getting enough connection. But I think there's a general absence of understanding of exactly why that matters. I personally think that it's helpful to start with looking back historically. Like, people tend to understand that we are wired for connection, but like, what does that really mean, and why are we wired for connection? And the answer stems from our sort of ancient origins, that humans exist really well in groups. We survive really well in groups. And so when placed on a planet like Earth, with a harsh climate and with predators and all sorts of challenges, humans survived best historically in groups. And so our brains were kind of incentivized to make us enjoy being around each other. And so what that actually looks like in the brain is that the human brain, and the brains of animals too, which are social, we have these social reward systems where being with others and connecting with others drives the release of specific neurotransmitters in certain areas of the brain that are basically rewarding. Like, dopamine is one of those neurotransmitters. Serotonin is one of those neurotransmitters, and oxytocin is another one of those neurotransmitters. All three of those are in some way linked some more directly than others to reward, right? Like a mouse or a rat will literally just press a lever to have dopamine stimulated in their brain because it's that reinforcing. Similarly, humans have this system so that we're encouraged, we're rewarded, and we're reinforced by being around other people. And so on the other side of that coin, it's bad for humans to be isolated from this evolutionary viewpoint, right? Like I said, humans survive best in groups. Humans don't survive nearly as well on their own. And so the way I look at it, the brain needed to build in some system that makes us feel, oh my gosh, I need to be around people when we're not with people. And so actually the brain's stress systems are wired into the isolation systems, or the absence of social interaction, where being isolated actually activates a stress response. It drives cortisol levels. It creates all sorts of bad problems, just as chronic stress does. And I believe that is actually intentional. I think that's the brain trying to motivate us to say, hey, when you're by yourself, I'm going to make sure that you feel terrible so that you're motivated to go connect with others again. But the problem is, in today's society, there's a lot of changes that are sort of out of our control. And we're kind of losing sight collectively of our inherent need for connection, where instead of, going to the grocery store and chatting with the deli clerk or whatever, you're ordering on Instacart. And instead of, going to see your friends in person, you're on FaceTime or Zoom. I mean, we're on Zoom right now, there's all sorts of changes that are happening that are causing us to withdraw from one another. And I don't necessarily think that that's good. And so the purpose of the book really is to sort of remind people that we do need face-to-face connection, and not just remind, because, that could be done in one paragraph, but to explain through the entire book of why that's really important. And so, we're simply wired for it. We need it.
Mm-hmm. So fascinating. And it correlates to the research I've studied that if you have one or two authentic friends, you live longer. I mean, just you live longer when you have friends, even just a few friends, community, and how important and how life-giving that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you would be shocked by some of the statistics showing like isolated people are just more prone to death by any cause, sadly. And I mean, it's amazing the health giving properties of connection that you would never expect. Things like, after people if people have a stroke, if someone has a stroke and then they're discharged from the hospital, if they go back into an environment where they live alone or they're isolated, they're much more likely to have another stroke or die in the next few years than if they're given social support. Same thing with like heart attack, things like that. It's unbelievable. Like these things where once you hear the numbers, you're like, wow, that's, like what I just said, you hear that, you're like, that's pretty shocking to think about. But because in real life, you don't relate those things. Grandpa has a stroke, grandpa goes home and lives alone, and grandpa has another stroke. You're not thinking, oh, it's because they're isolated, right? But when you zoom out on these population numbers, you're like, oh my gosh, this is really sort of shocking. And we have to do something about this, like, why not visit grandpa, right? Like I actually have a section in my book called Visit Your Grandparents, because it matters so much, and isolation is so unhealthy.
Yeah, it's so important. And the research of elderly people, they live longer when they have family, they have connection.
Yeah.
My mother is, if you can believe it, 96 years old, and
Wow.
she's thriving. She went through some tough stuff this winter, but she's had been living independently. We moved her to a place where actually there's a little more connection. But she has all kinds of friends and a community, and we're a huge family. And you can see how she, in a certain level, is thriving because it means so much to her. She
Yeah.
gets so much stimulus from all of us every single day.
That's amazing. And by the way, just as a note for listeners, it's never too late. It's really never too late to intervene. There are studies where they've taken people who, live in, senior living, and then they bring in social interventions where for like 6 months they have people interact with each other and their health starts to improve. They literally show these like positive health changes. And there's also one of those studies took it to the level of brain imaging. And they actually found that there were structural brain changes in people who were socialized, specifically in what's called like the attention network, which, when you're focusing on something, your brain's paying attention. And it makes sense to me because when you're in a social interaction, there's so much information to take in. You're looking at body language and what they're saying, and you're really focusing on the interaction so much more than you would do so when like watching TV or something like that. Or, so I think these exercises, like social interaction really is an exercise. And so by building those exercises into your daily routine, especially in at advanced ages, I really think you're doing a great service for your biology.
Thank you for sharing that point. That's a great point. I was curious to ask you the difference, and you talk about the difference between virtual interactions or in-person connections. So from a research standpoint, you find a difference there, it sounds like.
Yeah, so in person is better. The research is emerging. There's, we because COVID is really what started a lot of the virtual interaction stuff. And so we've only had a few years to study it, but the research seems to show that people don't feel as happy or satisfied after having virtual interactions. And given the
Interesting.
premise, yeah, given the premise that social connection is good for you, I mean, you'd be shocked by some of the data too. Like I can almost assure you that if someone gave you a survey before this and asked your mood, and then at the end of this conversation they gave you the same survey, your mood will have improved. Interacting makes us feel better. Those effects that I'm describing aren't as pronounced when it's a virtual interaction. So if we were sitting face to face having this conversation, you might show a bigger boost in mood, and the less lifelike the interaction is, the poorer the mood benefits are. So like texting someone doesn't really help you at all. Talking on the phone or having a video chat is better, but it's not quite as good as interacting in person.
Mm-hmm. Very fascinating. And you also study the science of likability, I believe. Can you share what helps being likable from a neurological level?
Yeah, well, I should clarify. I don't study it myself, but I've read a lot about it, and
Mm-hmm.
I talk about it in the book. So there are many things that determine likability. Because of course this is an important science, although it may seem like a vain science, it is important because after all, making a good impression on people and building healthy relationships, it requires a mutual liking, right? So some of the things that determine likability are uncontrollable, sadly, like your appearance and your
Mm.
name, these kinds of things, which you wouldn't really expect. But there are funny studies where people say like there are people. The studies show that people with less common names are viewed less favorably, actually. Um,
That's fascinating. I've not heard that before.
yeah, and I should clarify here. The scientist in me is like, hold on, caution. Um,
Mhm.
it's not that if like we presented your picture and then a variety of different names, if it was a less likable or a less common name, that they would say, I don't like her as much. It's more so that when given lists of names, people actually they associate fewer positive traits with the
Mhm.
less common names. So like a name like Catherine or Ben, very common names, people are more likely to say, oh yeah, I think Catherines are trustworthy, Catherines are honest. Unfortunately, also people trait less easy to pronounce names as less trustworthy. And it's funny because not to bring politics into this, but it makes me think of Kamala Harris ran for president. A lot of people thought her name was Kamala, there's all sorts of names. And when you're running for an office like president, it's important to be viewed as trustworthy. And when you have a difficult to pronounce name, people view you as less trustworthy. And so I always think about, I wonder, if her name was Catherine, right? Like Catherine Harris, would she have done better, pulled better? I always think about how funny that is, that like that specific little thing could have influenced the outcome of the election. But yeah, so otherwise, aside from the uncontrollables, there are many controllable things, luckily. Interestingly, mimicry is a really important factor for likability. And mimicry happens automatically. It's shocking. Like you would not notice it as much as it happens, but it's always happening. And if you watch two people interact, you can see it. Like if we weren't talking about this topic right now openly, and let's say I sat back and I folded my arms, it's very likely that within the next minute or two, you would find yourself also folding your arms.
Mhm.
It's something that the body just kind of does naturally. It's thought to be like an affiliative behavior. It's saying like, hey, look, I'm on your team. I would like to affiliate with you. But when people are mimicked, they actually like that person more, which is kind of funny because um, you wouldn't maybe expect that. But like, there's studies where people have a research subject paired up with an actor, and when the actor was instructed to mimic that person's body language more, they ended up rating that actor as more likable at the end of it, which is probably because of that affiliative nature of mimicry. That it's saying, hey, I want to be on your side, I want to be on your team. Um, other things too that make you more alike are generally make you more likable. So, if you behave in certain ways that are similar, if you speak in the same way, if you come from a certain part of the country or the world where you speak a certain way, you have an accent, and that person has the same accent, you're more likely to like them. Um, there's so many. I'm trying to run through them in my head.
It sounds like relatability when you can relate to someone. And body language. I mean, there's so much research also, body language. Like you just said a minute ago, if someone's sitting back folding their arms, you feel that energy, and we're energy. And
Yeah.
I think it comes partly, in my opinion, down to energy, because we're energy, we have an energy field, and we feel that energy. And then all of a sudden we're like, wow, that feels different.
Yeah. And what's funny too about mimicry is that people who have people who suffer from social anxiety are much less likely to mimic because they're, like I said, mimicry is something that happens naturally. But if you're you can interfere with it and override it. And if you're very anxious in social settings, you're much more likely to be monitoring your own behavior and your body language and thinking about everything you're doing and saying instead of noticing and paying attention to your partner's behaviors. And so because of that, people who are high in social anxiety mimic less because it's this natural process is kind of blocked, and as a result they're actually viewed as less likable. So it's important to actually kind of take your mind off of yourself and dive into the energy that the person you're with is giving you, and just like kind of let your body lead the way. Of course, like I say, mimicry is controllable, but there are limits to this, right? You don't want to be like mimicking mirroring, right? Like becoming a mime,
Right,
doing every single
right.
thing.
Yeah,
That
no,
would be
that this
ridiculous.
makes sense. It all makes sense. Which, coming back to your book, what's happening in our brain when we experience empathy? So I think of empathy, standing in the other person's shoes, we're connecting with them.
Yeah. So I was pretty empathy is something I have studied myself in research labs. And when I first entered the space and learned about empathy in the brain, I was so shocked because ultimately what it comes down to is that empathy basically involves you in some ways matching their brain state. So for instance, if you were to witness someone experience something painful, I could come up with 100 examples. You know what? I'm going to come up with an example, a very specific example. So let's say you're walking past a construction site and you see one of the workers get his foot run over by a bulldozer. Okay, you're standing there, you witness this. How do you feel imagining that right now, Catherine?
Oh, painful.
Yeah,
I gotta
right.
go, yikes, ouch.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
feel a sense, you don't even, you're just picturing it. So you're not even witnessing it. You feel a sense of discomfort, right?
Mhm.
And so what the research shows is that when people empathize with pain specifically, their brain, many of the brain areas involved in pain activate. And so specifically though, it's not the parts of the brain that correspond to the physical sensation of pain. It's the parts of the brain that correspond to the emotional sensation of pain. Because when you're experiencing pain, your brain has a signal that's like, this is bad, get me away from this, right? And then you're also separately, your brain is encoding the actual physical sensation. And that first part, that emotional part, that this is bad, get me away from this, those are the parts of the brain that activate for empathy for pain, which is interesting because it makes sense. You can't really reactivate the entire pain complex in the brain, but it's parts of it. And so to think that when you're feeling someone else's emotions or you're empathizing with them, your brain is literally engaging a similar pattern of neural circuitry that matches what they're experiencing. And, empathy is such a valuable asset for human beings and many species. And indeed, many species do show empathy. You'd be surprised, like minnows and mice and all sorts of stuff. But because without that mirroring of the pain experience, you lose two things if you don't feel empathy. Number one, you no longer can learn from someone else's experience because when you watch someone get their foot run over and your brain tells you, "Ooh, this is bad," don't get your foot run over, which is helpful for your survival and for your learning. And the second thing is, if you don't feel bad in watching their pain, you're not motivated to intervene and help them. So empathy is super valuable for both of those reasons. Number one, it teaches us so we can live vicariously through others, and two, it motivates helping behavior, which is really how we define compassion, is a layer above empathy, where you're not just caring about someone, but you're motivated to step in and help them.
I love the fact layer above yeah, compassion. And I'm hearing what you're saying is empathy is how we connect, our connection, connect with one another.
Yeah, empathy is specifically the sharing of someone else's emotions or the understanding of someone else's emotions.
Mhm.
And it's, yeah, it is critical for connection.
Here's what I'm curious to ask you. In my training as a chaplain for years, working with the largest health system here in the Twin Cities, Fairview, we had specific training on empathy
Hmm.
versus compassion. And I think back at Joan Halifax's work of her really well-known TED Talk on empathy versus compassion. And that was part of the training. But it was like, okay, you connect with someone by empathy. You're standing in their shoes. That's how we connect with everyone. But then the importance of differentiating, coming back and standing in your own shoes from a place of compassion to help decrease empathic distress and burnout. And that was a really big learning point. I remember in my career in the medical field of coming from a place of compassion versus empathy, because empathy, it's so draining when you're witnessing so much suffering. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, empathy can be draining. And although I will clarify one thing, empathy can also be good. Like you can, if someone is receiving an award on stage and you love that person and you feel good, that's also empathy.
Yep,
So
I agree.
empathy can also be energizing. Um, but yeah, I mean, compassion is important. I think compassion is what makes humans human. And, you know, in many ways, it makes us our civilizations work, and it's necessary, and it's probably the most effective use of empathy. Right? It's you have feeling, you feel for someone, you care about them. What do you do with that? You could feel bad, and that's it, and you could take that feeling home with you, or you can step in and you can provide aid to them if they need it. And I think that's what we probably need to do more of. Um, because yeah, I mean, otherwise, you know, the brain can tire of empathy. You know, there's actually studies that, for instance, when people go through medical training and they spend years in the hospital observing others' distress, their empathy gradually declines, actually,
Mhm.
which is not, that doesn't mean that they're monsters. It means that their brains are like, I can't do this anymore. I'm seeing every single day I'm seeing someone in pain. I need to adapt for my own well-being. And, you know, I think that type of process, like empathy, is malleable and flexible. And by channeling that energy into compassion, it's probably the most useful way to put empathy to work, I think.
I witness that regularly working at our level one trauma hospital, Hennepin County Medical Center. The burnout. I mean, when you work in the emergency room and the stabilization room with the four highest trauma people that are coming in hour after hour after hour, it just you need to learn how can I be here? How can I help this person, but not take it in where I'm just completely drained.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it can definitely get the best of you. I mean, when you think about the fact that you're actually activating those parts of the brain that the person who is suffering is also activating, I mean, you're genuinely suffering. You know, your brain is suffering, and so yeah, it's a delicate balance. But at the same time, you know, without empathy, would I don't think that the healthcare profession would work. You know, like you need to care, right?
Mhm. You
Um,
you need to care 100%.
yeah, and
Yeah.
that's what makes us special, and that's what makes, you know, us work so well as societies and cultures of groups and not individuals.
Mhm. In your research, have you studied a differentiation? I mean, I'm just curious how you would name empathy versus compassion, or do you see they flow back and forth from one another? I'm curious.
No, there is a distinction. So there's a four-tier sort of step staircase where the bottom step is pity. Pity is you are aware of someone's suffering, but you don't care. You are emotionally detached. And so an example of this might be, you know, there's a wasp trapped in your house and it keeps buzzing against the window, and you're like, you know, I hate wasps. I don't want to get stung by it. I pity the thing, right? It's
Mhm.
I could care less. Sympathy is the next step up. Sympathy is you care, you recognize someone's in distress and you care, but you're not sharing their emotions. You are just, you know, you feel a little bit worse. Maybe this is a a squirrel is trapped in the median in a busy road, and you're like, oh, that poor thing, I hope it gets out of the way. You're not
Yep.
feeling panicked like the squirrel is. You're not empathizing with it, but you do feel bad for it, right? Maybe because it's a little bit, you like squirrels better than wasps, maybe. Then there's empathy, which is you do feel bad, and you're actually sharing their emotions. Specifically, you're taking on their emotions. And then above that is compassion, where not only are you taking on their emotions, but you want to help. You are motivated to help, and that is what distinguishes compassion from empathy.
Hmm. Thanks for sharing that. Really helpful. And it sounds like the training, for the most part, we had in a medical setting. I think a big takeaway that I learned was just, okay, you start with empathy, but then can you just try to stand in your own shoes to help another?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the training then was more of like understand and experience their feelings, but then distance yourself to make you
Yep.
more effective at helping them.
Yep, and don't attach the outcomes. Be there in the moment with them and do the best you can to be supportive and helpful, but not attached to what's going to happen.
That's so interesting. That makes sense because yeah, then you're exercising compassion, but without the maybe unnecessary pain of empathy.
Mhm. While we're on this subject, I just I have to ask you again, this is a piece working with in high trauma situations as a chaplain that I did for years and in hospice where I was with people at end of life. Now I have a private practice. But I also learned a key takeaway game changing was working with energy, actually energy boundaries. And I learned this when I was working at the trauma hospital where I was present. Yes, I was empathetic. I was mindful of compassion, but I was attuned to the fact that we're energy. We have an energy field around us and how to work with that energy so that I did not consciously take in the energy of the chaos in the ER. Honestly, it was, I mean, I know this is kind of more nuanced, but it was really game changer. In fact, I work with energy every single day. I'm noticing I can feel, I'm intuitive, I can pick up energy. And being empathic and sensitive, it really does give me space and breathing room. Do you have any comments about working with energy boundaries in your research?
It's not something I know much about. I mean, but it sounds like the way you're describing it, and actually, I'd love to hear you describe it more, is like you're sort of recognizing that if you let the external energy invade and sort of color your energy, that it then it impacts you. But you're working on building a sort of protective shield around that. Is that right?
Exactly. And exciting to share with you the latest textbook, Integrative Medicine by David Rakel. There's a little section on this. So, integrative medicine field doctors are recognizing that we're energy, we have an energy field. And my colleague, Dr. Greg Plotnikoff, and I wrote a chapter in that book. So when I was studying the book, I
Well,
was like, oh my gosh, here's a section on energy that I've been teaching people for 20 years. So yeah, seeing like eggshell as far as our energy field is around us, an eggshell where the energy hits the eggshell and drops away, or use mirrors or set intention. And when I do that every single morning, I maybe miss once a year. When I do that, I can feel just more spaciousness, more groundedness. I guess I understand this might be a little more esoteric, but curious
yeah,
to
I certainly have nothing of you know expert level commentary to add at all. This is
ask.
a foreign space to me. I mean, I think. Have you ever heard of the book The Untethered Soul?
Of course. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Fabulous.
So I recently read that, and
Mhm.
I haven't I don't know, I haven't really taken much time to explore spiritualism as defined,
Mhm.
in that book. Um, and so I don't know, all of there's a whole world of information over there that I really don't engage with. But I mean, I don't know, obviously the way you're using it is helping you and helping others. And I think that's awesome. I think if you can help people live healthier lives and take control of, their emotions and their daily lives and
Mhm.
experiences, I mean, that's the most powerful gift that someone can have.
Well, I'd love to continue the dialogue on energy with you in the future because I work with it mindfully and I really notice a difference. I wanted to ask you about the neuroplasticity field, which is all the work you do as a scientist and researcher. I've been passionately studying neuroplasticity. I've trained with Rick Hansen, his positive neuroplasticity model. You may have heard of maybe DNRS, Annie Hopper, and Judson Brewer. What I find is they all have the four main steps of how we can rewire our brain. I mean, it's just so fascinating by what we think and feel in our environment, how our brain is changing and the neural pathways are changing till the day we die. And curious to ask you with your research, do you hear are these common steps? I mean, this is what I've gleaned from the work I've done and the research I've done of starting with defining number one, when you're in a negative, worry, anxious thought, the four steps are when you're in a worry, anxious thought, to identify that thought. Number one, oh, I keep worrying about this, or I'm anxious about this, or I'm fearful about this. When you can name it, starts to calm your nervous system. Number two, when you can name the feeling, like, oh, I'm angry, I'm anxious, which is not always easy, but when you name the feeling, it calms your nervous system. Number three, feeling the feeling helps dissipate it. We all know, the pathway to healing, you need to feel your feelings. And then the fourth, and this is a big part of Rick Hansen's work, is growing the good, marinating the good. I go to the image of my dogs and my heart just like, oh, blossoms.
Yeah.
So I have found those four steps of how we create positive neural pathways in our brain very common among many models. Love to hear your thoughts on this and your steep research.
Yeah, no, that's amazing the way you describe it. I mean, I will say in traditional academic circles, if you were to ask this question, like, are these common practices? 99 out of 100 neuroscientists will say, I have no idea what the hell you're talking about.
That's why I'm asking you.
Yeah, right. And I'm right. So from that perspective, the way that traditional neuroscientists, my colleagues at Stanford and elsewhere think about neuroplasticity is this is a deeply molecular, micro level process that is understood really well on like a biological level. We understand how it happens and what it does and why it happens and stuff and how it changes throughout life. But specific behavioral strategies to like harness plasticity are less well understood because it's really difficult to study. Like, how do you study what's happening in your brain on the micro level of a synapse? You truly cannot. The best thing you could do is you could look at like generally are certain brain areas becoming more active or communicating more with each other. But so if you were to describe what you just said to most academics, they'd be like, I don't know what you're talking about, but with that said, if we think about something like therapy, like going to a counselor and having therapy, this is if it's working and you're actually using it correctly, you're doing it right, that should in some ways rewire certain parts of your brain, right? And the way you think about things and the way you feel and just sort of everything about the human experience comes back to what's happening in your brain, and so I hate to simplify it that way, but like most of the time we can say, oh, well, there's less activity in this brain area or whatever. So if you can take control of your thoughts, that means that you're changing the way that your brain is working. And so the way you described it, it makes tons of sense. If you're feeling down or you're feeling anxious or whatever it is, especially if it's your brain's sort of natural pattern or learned pattern to do that or feel that, what you described makes perfect sense. You stop, you recognize it. Okay, what am I feeling? What's going on? And in doing so, you're naming a feeling, but what you're really naming is a specific process in your brain. So two areas are interacting or three areas or whatever it is. And then you're saying, okay, stop. I don't want to do that. I'm going to think about my sweet loving dog. You're actually interrupting specific patterns of activity and shoving them in a totally different direction that serves you better. And I think that's amazing. And whether that actually in the long run will change the way your brain operates, and that like when you're anxious, then all of a sudden it'll naturally detour itself over to being happy. Who's to say? I have no idea. But what you absolutely are doing is you're exercising and strengthening that like brain muscle of doing what you're doing, redirecting your thoughts and reorienting your mood into a way that's more positive and uplifting. And that is something that requires plasticity, because anytime there's change happening in the brain, plasticity is occurring. If you're changing the way you feel, the way you think, however, the way you conceptualize an issue in your life, plasticity must be happening. And so I think where I get a little bit more like skeptical is any claims that like certain practices will enhance the level of neuroplasticity in a given moment. And I'm making something up, but like if you take 6 deep breaths and then you take 4 short breaths, that it'll enhance your neuroplasticity. You can't be sure. Maybe it'll help you in the process of thinking through it, but like it's really difficult to track these things down in the brain. So anyways, I hope that all makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think some of these studies, so for example, DNRS, Annie Hopper, a way to rewire your brain, she's using it also as data points, I think, of showing how people can improve their life overall. But overall, what
Oh,
I'm hearing is that yes, we can create positive new neural pathways in our brain. And I think also I'm just thinking of Rick Hanson's work, his whole heal. He has a book on heal, having a positive experiencing and enriching and absorbing it, and then eventually potentially linking it to maybe a negative experience, in your brain, but exactly what you're saying. And does that sound accurate to you? I mean, we at the end of the day we can create positive new pathways, neural pathways in our brain.
oh yeah, no doubt. I mean, the way that you look at ideas or think about things or feel, none of it is truly, well, most of it isn't hard, written forever. You can absolutely change, and there's evidence all of this all over the place. If you ever go through a breakup, and you that completely change the way you view the person who was maybe closest to you in your life, or you lose a loved one and you go through tremendous grief, and then eventually you change your kind of perspective to see how it was maybe a good thing, and how maybe they were suffering and now they're better for it, and there's examples of this all over the place. And I think that really this is sort of the nature of like what therapy is one example. It's important to work on your challenges. And the important thing too is that in most cases, this is not something that will happen naturally. It requires active thought. The brain is an organ of thought. And so if you wish to redirect your emotions or change the way you feel, it might happen gradually. Like if with a breakup, for example, eventually the pain and the stinging will go away. But to actively do introspection and think about your emotions and exactly like you said, stop. What's this feeling? Why is it happening? Where do I feel it? That is such an important process to build in, because I think it's a fantastic skill. And unfortunately, I don't think enough people spend the time developing that skill.
Mm-hmm. And I agree, even going back to therapy, in therapy with hopefully a really skilled person you're working with, they empathize with you, you're being seen, you're being soothed. I mean, these are just basic attachment pieces, attachment theory from very early childhood, of just someone maybe not seen or soothed as a child, and now all of a sudden, wow, they're starting to be seen, they're soothing, they're starting to see themselves. It's powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And the therapeutic alliance, right, between the
Mhm.
therapist and the patient, it's so important.
Critical, yeah. In the arena of spirituality, when people say, oh, they see spirits or angels or have mystical experiences, and potentially maybe it's related to the pineal gland. I know I've seen a little bit of your work on this, or wondering how does the pineal gland work. I'm just curious to ask you any thoughts on this, on the mystical arena of life relating to our brain.
Um, I have a lot of thoughts, and I'm afraid they may not. I'm afraid you may not like them.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm all good.
I very recently was on a plane, a long flight, and I started talking to my neighbor, and she was a very interesting character. She's a hospice nurse and also a member of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. And we were talking deeply about this, and it was a similar thing where I was like, I don't know if my views are going to be like, if you're going to like this, but
Yeah.
honestly, I think that it sucks to say out loud because it's really kind of sad, but I just think that when like we are an organ. I think that I am this organ, and when the electrical activity leaves this organ, I will no longer experience life. And as much as I would love to believe in an afterlife, I don't bet on it. And I think that in some ways is a good thing, in some ways it's a bad thing. Obviously it's a good thing because that's like, all right, hey, like, hate to use this phrase, but YOLO, right? Like you only live once. This is it, right? I better make the most of it. But on the other side, it makes death terribly frightening. But of course, there are all sorts of incredible stories and documentations of afterlife type experiences. And yeah, I mean, I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to go more into like the specifics of my viewpoints if you'd like.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think at the end of the day, our experiences shape our understanding of life, what we've experienced, what we've lived through. And yeah, my story is unique in that I've already faced my death twice as a child. I had a near-death experience in my 30s as a hospice chaplain. I was with hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people as they left their body, which is unusual. I mean, not many people probably can say that. And it was a calling, and it was so sacred. So I had some interesting mystical experiences and just reality. So take it with a grain of salt. In my view,
No,
I have no doubt that we have some kind of spirit soul. I feel it. I had a spirit experience like this at 11 years old. And
wow.
so again, going back to our experiences shape our life, our reality, and it's all good. It's about being open. At the end of the day, being
Yeah.
open to everyone. That's it.
Like, yeah, exactly. And what's funny is this is very reminiscent of that conversation I had on the plane, because what I told her, because she said something very similar. She's witnessed death in person many times, and she's seen incredible things. And like you said, we are the product of our lived experience. I told her, I said, look, you heard my viewpoint, but if I lived your life, I'd probably have a completely different viewpoint. There's no doubt about it. And yeah, I mean, I remain open to all possibilities, and I think that's the sign of a healthy human. Like, you have information, it informs your perspective, but I don't think it's ever good to be like, oh, I'm so firmly planted in my perspective that anybody else's opinions can never break through. Like, I wish I had the ability to see some of the things that you've seen, because I totally think it would change my perspective on life after death, or the afterlife. And maybe that would make me a happier person. Maybe that would make me view my life differently. Most likely it would. And I think that's a important characteristic too.
Mhm. And I think, again, yeah, like you just said, openness is everything. And my husband is a business executive and more really mathematical, scientific. And 20 some years ago, when things opened up more and experiencing all this, my husband was like, oh, really? We're trying to define it. And now he's like, he's along for the ride.
Yeah. No, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah, being open. And you have a lot of life ahead of you. Who knows?
Right.
Yeah. I want to end with a question because my book out in the world is called Everyday Awakening: How We Live a Full, Vibrant Life. I want to ask you what you think awakening means. What does the word awakening mean to you?
Hmm. I think, to me, I think awakening means broadening your awareness to include everything you need to know. So many people have, myself included, have lived through periods of life where there are things that you don't want to be true, but are true. And I think once you accept those truths, to me, that's awakening. And that kind of sounds like sinister the way I frame it, but it's like, it's kind of, I hate to make this about science, but it's kind of like science too, where like you do experiments and you have a sort of hypothesis about what's going on, and you're so firm, like, this is definitely what's happening. I'm pretty sure, like, the data seem to be showing it. And then you get one result where it's like, wait a minute, am I completely wrong? And what a lot of scientists do is, instead of accepting the scary, horrifying possibility that you're wrong and doing the experiment that will prove to yourself if you're wrong, they're just like, I'm just going to stick to what I got here and just like not ask those questions. And I think asking those questions, obviously in science, but also just in daily life, is important, and letting all truths have their space in the light, regardless of whether you like them or not.
Thank you for sharing that. That sounds deeply spiritual. What I'm hearing, feeling is acceptance,
Yes.
surrender now, what is. I mean, truly, I think that, in my opinion, essence, yeah, of why we're here.
Yeah.
So lovely.
Acceptance is a good term for, yeah, definitely what I described.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. You are inspiring. You have a huge life ahead of you. I'm so excited for you. Your
Thank
book,
you so much.
so exciting. Congratulations, and love to continue the conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, me too. I really appreciate you having me.
Thank you so much for joining Everyday Awakening. Let's keep the conversation going online. You can follow me on Instagram at Catherine Duncan, MABCC. And to keep up to date on the show, subscribe on iTunes and leave a review. I'd love to hear from you.